Welcome to Italics, television for the Italian-American experience. I'm your host, Anthony Tamburri. Racial identity. For many, there is no question of where they stand within the disparate strata of our society, whether at the extremes of holding the strings of power at the very top of the hierarchy, or profiled as criminals for their very existence. For others, the question of racial identity, as determined by color or physical traits, is more blurred. As Italian Americans, we have examined questions of whether Italians are white. We have considered the lengths one must go to in order to assimilate and whether one should necessarily assimilate. Do we want in or do we want out of a system that is exclusionary? In his new book, A Great Conspiracy Against Our Race, Italian Immigrant Newspapers, and the Construction of Whiteness in the early 20th century, Peter Vellon explores the role of the radical press in the assimilation of Italian immigrants, once undesirable, into the dominant white culture from 1886 through 1920. The topic is one that still resonates clearly today. Commemorating Black History Month and the increased awareness and activism we have seen in recent months with the Black Lives Matter movement, we at Italics thought it apropos. Let's go to Joe Shore at the Calandra Institute for a conversation with scholar Peter Vellon.
Peter, tell us a little bit about the book.
A Great Conspiracy Against Our Race is really an examination of the Italian language press in New York City. And I treat it as a cultural production of the immigrant community. And really the purpose behind it was to examine how the press kind of constructed an identity for Italians that didn't exist upon their arrival. And really what it talks about is how they negotiated this identity as Italians and over time as Americans, and by 1910, 1920, assertively, calling themselves white.
In terms of circulation numbers, all right, if you look at a paper like Il Progresso, I think the height of its circulation is right out of the World War I period. You're talking about 175,000 copies. By 1919, that circulation is about 108,000, but there's also a 16-page Sunday supplement that they publish. That has a circulation of 95,000 or so. That's just one newspaper. So by 1910, you're talking of all the Italian language press in New York City in 1910, you're talking about a circulation of about 200,000 papers. That don't get me started on these papers being handed to people to read, okay, as well as, and there's constant, there's a ton of, contemporary observations about how these papers were read aloud to folks in their homes, in their kitchens, around the fire. So that their reach was much more than circulation numbers. I mentioned the commercial press or the mainstream press, whatever you want to call it. We'll probably call it for our purposes the prominente press, okay? These are the newspapers started by what become known as the prominent people, the so-called self-proclaimed, in many instances, community leaders, okay, of these Italian communities. During this fluid period of immigration, newspapers worked through their own notion of how Italian immigrants should act and behave, while simultaneously trying to defend their race from American attacks on their suitability for citizenship and their full inclusion in American society. And these attacks were not only figurative, in words, but literal attacks.
I look at how the press treats African Americans in the United States with respect to violence against African Americans, and given that there was violence against Italian immigrants, they really use the African American experience initially as a kind of a shared experience. They make sense out of American violence against immigrants by comparing it to how Americans treat African Americans, which is kind of obviously interesting because there are a number of lynchings of Italians, and it did not go unnoticed to newspaper owners that this was primarily a form of murder aimed at African Americans in the United States.
Early on, as we'll see, they'll find some common ground with the African American experience. But soon, because of this learning of what of what happens to African Americans in the United States, or those deemed non-white, they soon begin to understand the heavy stigma of being viewed as non-white, or in their case, a better phrase I like to use, other historians have used, like David Roediger, is this kind of in-between status. Okay, so we're not making a parallel between the experience of Italian immigrants and African Americans at all, but what we're talking about is this kind of in-between status that immigrants from Southern Eastern Europe are kind of thrust into in the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States, okay? And how do they negotiate this status?
What you begin to see is by 1890s, early 1900s, in the mainstream press, there's really a stark discussion over the fact that African Americans are being denied their rights because they have darker skin, that white supremacy rests upon oppression of darker others. The immigrant press, especially papers like Il Progresso Italo-Americano, really have strident commentary against this. There are outright quotes that say, this poor black man was lynched just because he had darker skin than his oppressor.
You see, obviously, in the radical press, it's a much more obvious progressive view. They're coming from a class-based analysis, but there is consistent scorn over white supremacy as well as capitalist exploitation. I kind of expected that from the radical press. What I didn't expect was to see in newspapers like Il Progresso this really kind of in-depth discussion of how white supremacy worked in the United States. And when papers are consistently using and covering the lynching of African Americans or race riots that are taking place around the country and in New York City involving whites and blacks, and making strident commentary, such as, I'm paraphrasing a quote, but in one Il Progresso article talking about a race riot that took place in New York in 1900, they basically said that the poor Negro was the word that was used. The poor Negro was rendered helpless, and a rope was put around his neck by his white oppressor simply for the crime of having darker skin. So when I saw stuff like that in Il Progresso, I have to say, a little surprised. But there is this, not every article during that period is going to have as strident commentary like that, but you do see it, and there's a lot of coverage. As the press is kind of covering what's going on, right, with African Americans in the United States and kind of putting their finger on, hey, these folks are being lynched because they're darker, black, right, than white Americans. They're also covering what's going on in their community, all right? And you do see a number of lynchings of Italian immigrants over, in 1886 is one, there's 3 in the 1890s. So there's this kind of uneasy place that they are in, right? And how do they respond to that? Well, initially they respond to that by being highly critical of the United States. Obviously, they condemn American so-called civilization. Okay, they are very attuned to the fact that skin color is the primary determinant here, as they see it, in terms of white supremacy.
There's this kind of sympathy for the period, 1890s, early 1900s. But there's this kind of dual purpose as they begin to understand how white Americans view non-whites. And I'm not suggesting in the book that Italian immigrants were treated similarly to African Americans, but their race and their whiteness was in question at times.
Both the Prominente press and even the radical press are going to, when it's time to really display their just utter horror over something, whether it be the fact that miners were killed in a strike, you would see that on strike, and miners were killed by a coal company. You would see that in a radical newspaper, for instance, or in a Prominente newspaper, whether it was if Italian was lynched. If they had to express their horror over what America did, you would often see Africa being used as an example to kind of describe savagery or barbarism. Okay, so Africa is constantly described as kind of dark, black, murky. Continente nero is a phrase you see consistently. Africa tenebrosa. So this kind of dark, black, murky place. One common strategy was to, when they needed to criticize American morality, often, as I said, in response to violence against Italians, would be to compare it to the savagery of Africa. Through that, you see how Africa becomes a convenient trope for folks wrestling with their own kind of questionable status in what they see as, at times, a very inhospitable country.
As they begin to understand how the American racial hierarchy works, what you begin to see is by the 1910s, especially by the World War I period, they begin to really assertively claim that not only are they Italian and kind of create this new construction of identity as Italians that didn't exist before. And they assert their whiteness very vehemently, and you see this in several newspapers. You see this in terms of fighting against immigration restriction laws, where they basically say, look, America is a white nation and we belong in America. We are not an inferior race like you depict us. We are a civilized race, and they kind of create a kind of mythic Italian race that harkens back to Rome and the Renaissance, that didn't exist pre-unification or even post-unification.
They constantly question American civilization by propping up the Italian race. So they'll consistently criticize America for acting like savages of Africa and say that we don't do that. We are civilized. We have taught the Americans, we were civilized before the Americans, and this is how they're treating us. Italian colonialism provided Prominenti a chance to construct an Italian racial identity as civilized, as conqueror, okay? Again, all around the subjugation of a darker other. Also, though, it served to try and influence American opinion of what quote-unquote real Italianism is, okay? In other words, you have to stop describing us as the organ grinder and the boot black and the ditch digger, okay? We are civilized conquerors, okay? And they constantly tie this into this message of this glory of Rome. They kind of create this mythic Italian past, almost as if to convince themselves rather than Americans. L'Araldo Italiano insisted, quote, without a doubt, with this war, American sympathy will be with Italy. That is, with intelligence and civilization against barbarism.
So there's this kind of top-down, very class-based construction of identity that these prominenti are putting out there in the press for themselves, for the Italian community, but also for the American community, with an eye towards American readers, to kind of say, look, we are not like those folks you keep depicting us as, and we know now what it means to kind of be treated as non-white, and we are certainly not like that. I kind of argue that this identity construction is taking place, within the pages of the radical press and the Prominenti press, but more so the book kind of gears towards the Prominenti press, given its much more widespread circulation, and I would argue a kind of greater impact on the community. Not always a beneficial impact, but I would argue that it had a more widespread impact. By 1920, Italians are really asserting that where they never really had before, earlier in the century, that they were white and should be included as such in the American Republic.
Are you saying that Italian Americans were considered not white enough?
There's this kind of hierarchy of races that has been changing by the late 19th century, that the way we talk about race today wasn't really the way folks talked about race 100 years ago. So what we would deem today as a nationality or an ethnicity, back then they saw them as races, often biologically constructed. I mean, we know that race, is socially constructed, but back then folks actually believed that you were kind of born with certain traits that permeated and persisted over generations. So Italians, although they were able to enter the country as free white people, they were kind of in, the word I use and other historians use is kind of in between this kind of white and black hierarchy. So their racial status was questioned consistently. You see that in government reports like the Dillingham Commission, which using some of the pseudoscience of the time, and anthropologists such as Giuseppe Sergi and Nicefero actually saw a separation between Northern Italians and Southern Italians. So they separated those races and saw the Southern Italian race as inferior.
This is from the Dillingham Commission reports. This was a major congressional investigation that was done, as Teddy Roosevelt said, to look into this quote-unquote problem of immigration. In 1906, it was the most money ever spent on a congressional investigation up to that point. They sent folks to Italy, all ports of embarkation, find out where these folks were coming from, where they were going. Long story short, part of that is a volume called the Dictionary of Races or Peoples, and using a lot of the kind of what we call pseudoscience now, the times, it's kind of eugenics-inspired science. they have all these classifications of the different races or peoples around the globe. It's no coincidence that the further you went down the chart, you were deemed less civilized, more savage, and non-white. The further you went up the chart, you were deemed more civilized, more prone to be able to exist in a Republican government and Democratic government, fair-haired and white. So that's how these taxonomies were constructed.
And this is why there's such an uproar at the time over these Italian immigrants coming to the United States, because many Americans, many of them who were pushing for immigration restriction as soon as Italians started coming in large numbers, saw that they were getting, or felt they were getting, the kind of dregs of Europe. There's this kind of uneasy existence that they are kind of thrust into in the United States. And things like violence directed at them in the form of lynching is kind of stoking this kind of almost inferiority complex, if you want to use that phrase, of Italian immigrants. And in many ways is, pushing prominenti newspapers to kind of defend their own. Even at the same time, they're trying to say, hey, listen, you shouldn't act like this, you Italian immigrants.
And especially, as we will see in these prominenti newspapers, these owners, editors, journalists really put forth a kind of a fledgling notion of Italian identity that only recently had emerged out of a unified Italy. And it's really going to be a kind of top-down, class-based view of what an Italian should be. Connection to the glory of Rome was consistently trotted out. This kind of creation of a unified Italian past. Il Progresso urged the Italian military to, quote, reconquer what used to belong to Rome. And differentiating between Italian civilization and African savagery, mainstream newspapers neatly incorporated Calabrians, Neapolitans, Sicilians, and all other provincial Italian immigrants into a collective identity that could stretch its lineage back to the Roman Empire.
One thing to remember also is that the folks that are pushing for immigration restriction, these aren't some, although we look back now and say maybe they're obviously extremists, but these weren't some, fringe organizations. These were very well-established, well-respected folks, presidents of major universities like Harvard, senators, that were pushing for immigration restriction and actually arguing that, these folks were going to dilute the American race. That would, they used terms like they would mongrelize the American race, and they obviously had a distinct definition of what American was, usually a kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant race. So, these weren't fringe organizations. There was severe pushback from the moment Italians started coming in large numbers against their presence in the United States.
So you say that the prominenti, these ethnic leaders, many of them editors of newspapers, were interested in referencing back to ancient Rome and to the Renaissance. And I know from your book and previous talks you've talked about this idea of civilization.
Coming out of the unification of Italy, there's really this kind of class-based, top-down construction of Italianità. Italians are coming at the time from villages in Naples and Calabria and Sicily, and they don't think of themselves as Italian. They never saw themselves as a kind of Italian nation or having a kind of nationalism as Italian. So there's this attempt to kind of construct an Italian race. And by doing that, it's interesting because they're constructing what an Italian race should look like, the prominenti, and at the same time they're also talking about, and you see this with the issue of the Southern question in Italy, of what the Italian race doesn't look like. So what the Italian race looks like is a race that seamlessly can trace its lineage to the glory of Rome, to the Renaissance, to all the great, folks that came through the pipeline, Columbus, Garibaldi. And this is why, for instance, Barzotti, who owns Il Progresso, begins to build these monuments, and he runs these subscription drives in his newspapers to have these monuments erected as a way to kind of gain prestige, not only for himself in the community, but also to this kind of wider American, in this case, New York City audience, that this is who we are, not the ditch diggers and the folks, the organ grinders you're depicting us as. It's kind of this creation of an identity that did not exist, that is really traced and formed by a mythical Italian past. And it serves multiple purposes, as I said, for prominenti. It enhances their prestige because they're the folks getting these getting the Columbus statue built. It enhances their prestige because they can walk in the Columbus Day Parade with the sash, and they're the fellows that got it done. But it was also a way to kind of show Americans this is who Italians are rather than who we are not. And there's always that tension because, as I said earlier, they're constantly defending the very Italians that they're sometimes railing against. It's like we may think that they're ditch diggers, but they're our ditch diggers. You can't make fun of them, but we'll take care of them. We'll show them how to be proper Americans. And being a civilized race was instrumental in that. So it's almost this kind of strategy. If we can show them that we are civilized, and we certainly have the goods in their mind to show it, right? And we have Rome, we have the Renaissance, and you constantly see this. Who were these Americans to lynch us? They didn't even know what civilization was 300 years ago. We show them. It was an Italian that brought civilization to them. So there's this constant, almost self-righteous, indignant attitude when they criticize American, morality or values that, we're the ones that created this. So it's an attempt to kind of show Americans we belong because we're the ones that taught you how to be civilized. So civilization and race, in color, they're all kind of working in tandem.
Given the prominentes and the newspaper editors' sort of master narrative about Italians, Italian culture, and race, is there any way of knowing to what degree the readership and the people on the ground really bought into these very notions?
All we can say is, these were very, very well-circulated newspapers. Folks were reading this. Sometimes it's probably not a great comparison, but in talks I've given, I talk about the influence of media today, we can't necessarily pinpoint how certain news channels impact folks that are watching it, but we can get a sense that they, hearing a message over and over again probably does have an impact. In my research, I did find some letters to the editor. There wasn't an overflow of letters, written to these newspapers, but given their circulation and given their large number of papers that touch different hands in the community, and the types of articles they were running, as well as cartoons that talked about some of these issues, I think we can say that they played a real major role, I would say, not the only role, but a major role in kind of forming the kind of racial consciousness of these immigrant communities.
For Italian language newspapers, this reality meant reminding white Americans that Italian immigrants belonged by not only appealing to the virtues of the Italian race, but also by insisting they were sufficiently white. This approach is reminiscent of Toni Morrison's observation that European immigrants became American by, quote, buying into the notion of American blacks as the real aliens. Italian Americans argued that it would be their children who would help sustain an enduring form of American whiteness, noting that the differences separating Americans and Italians paled in comparison to the differences separating white Americans and African Americans. Italian Americans increasingly situated themselves as part of the racial solution rather than the racial problem.
Do these arguments at the turn of the 20th century still resonate in some ways for Italian Americans and other communities as well in the 21st century?
They resonate very much so, unfortunately. I mean, if you look at some of the, racial incidents that have taken place, over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades, you kind of have to trace back, well, how did we get here? Why are some of these battles still being fought out? What is to be gained from this buying into whiteness? Obviously there's a lot to be gained, as we know, unfortunately. If we look back in the immigrant past, I think you see an immigrant group that in many ways is kind of I would argue, kind of a poster child for what Americanization does. And some of that could be argued as a good thing, but I would argue some of it is not so beneficial. There are gains and costs to quote-unquote Americanization. And one of the severe costs, I would argue, is that in buying into this narrative and this construction of and this assertion of having to say we are Italian and civilized and white, what they're basically doing is kind of being socialized into an American racial system that privileges white over black. And I think you see that over the past few decades, maybe not to the same degree, but when you have racial incidents that we've seen in New York City, especially involving Italian Americans and African Americans. And I think that in many ways reflects that Italian immigrants could be seen as the poster child for the model immigrant in American history. I mean, one could say. I mean, it's almost as if they bought in so well. They bought into this narrative that it may behoove them to kind of look at their past and kind of say, see that maybe it didn't have to be that way, that necessarily wasn't the only route towards becoming part of the fabric of this nation. And again, I'm not suggesting that all Italian Americans are involved in these incidents, but I think we can say that part of our history as Americans have definitely shown us that we still have a racial problem in the country today, and I think that the more we know about it and how it kind of was constructed in that manner, the better we'll all be.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate you having me.
Don't spend your precious time asking, why isn't the world a better place? It would only be time wasted. The question to ask is, how can I make it better? To that, there is an answer. Those are the words of the late Dr. Leo Buscaglia, also known popularly as Dr. Love. According to some of history's great thinkers, orators, and activists, the expression of love in its many forms can have great power for a positive change. Here is Professor Margherita to teach us some words of love in honor of San Valentino, whose holiday some just celebrated in the company of loved ones. The name Valentine, derived from valens, means worthy, strong, powerful. And here we have Professoressa Margherita to discuss il valore dell'amore e dell'amicizia.
Bravo, Anthony. In fact, we already spoke about amore, love. So today, because there are many kinds of love, we'll talk about friendship, amicizia. Yes, between two friends is amicizia. Amicizia. Now, when you love someone, either it's your partner, your parents, your relatives, your friends, when you show love, what do? You give a big hug. And so let me give you a big abbraccio. Yes, abbraccio. Abbraccio. There's not only abbraccio, there is also something else. And let me give you then a big kiss, bacio. Bacio. Let me say ciao with a big kiss, bacio to everyone.
Thanks for watching this episode of Italics. Tune in to our next episode airing March 25th. Catch up on previous editions of Italics at cuny.tv/show/italics and additional webisodes on our Italics YouTube channel, Italics TV. I'm Anthony Tamburri. Arrivederci alla prossima puntata.